So, okay then, Iran might actually be collapsing right now. I genuinely cannot believe that I am talking about this country again. But at this point, I guess that I am probably cursed, or I am in fact a prophet, since I actually did say at the end of my previous video on Iran that I could probably safely predict that things were going to get far worse for the country and that it could collapse. I did say this, and then lo and behold, this past week, I have been spammed with messages from you all who are watching my videos because of it, because, yeah, I traveled, and then everything around the world went to crap. The president of Venezuela got kidnapped, the protests are happening here. Unironically, things are getting really crazy. But yeah, at the time that I'm making this video, which is January 16th, 2026, and I'm currently in Thailand, which, yeah, you can join me on one of those group trips if you want to watch the world burn together here with me. Violent protests have been rocking the theocratic state of Iran for the last 2 weeks, or I guess it's over 2 weeks here at this point. It's nearing 3 weeks at this point. And this has resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of people having been killed by police and military forces who are firing live ammunition into crowds, and many more thousands of people have been arrested. The people of Iran are angry. Years of horrible economic mismanagement, theocratic authoritarianism, crumbling infrastructure, and the practical disappearance of water as a basic resource has proven to simply be too much to bear. As thousands of protesters pour into the streets of Iran night after night, leaders across the region and around the world are grappling with the possibility that the Islamic Republic could actually be overthrown. This would be a major event that would transform global geopolitics and energy markets as we know it. And that is not all. Even now, from the United States, President Trump has pledged to aid the protesters in the face of their brutal government crackdowns. Though, at this point that I'm making this video, we don't actually technically know yet what form that is going to take, if it ever actually does take place. But either way, Iran is panicking and has warned that the United States military and Israel would be legitimate targets if America uses force in order to protect demonstrators. And the thing is, with internet down in Iran and phone lines cut off, gauging the demonstrations, their strength, their impact, etc. from abroad has just grown increasingly more difficult. Independent verification of casualties and fatalities hasn't really been forthcoming, as Iran's government is not really offering overall casualty figures. Those abroad fear the information blackout is doing nothing more than emboldening hardliners within Iran's security services to launch a bloody crackdown, as they have done time and time again in the past. Over the past several weeks, video after video has come out showing protesters flooding into the streets of the capital of Iran as well as other cities. And not only that, but even outside of Iran, other videos have appeared of exiled Iranians converging on Iranian embassies, straight up going to them, cutting down the theocratic flag of the state, and then replacing it with the Persian flag that had to be removed after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. That is insane. And reports have emerged that the exiled crown prince of the old Pahlavi dynasty is urging protesters on and serving as a rallying cry for dissidents everywhere. This is insane. As it is, my friends, the world is watching, and it is waiting for what looks to be the genuine collapse of Iran itself. Something that, yeah, this has been predicted for many years, but really few could ever have imagined that after years and years of successful crackdowns on protests by the state, that things could get out of hand so bad and so quickly. Which, of course, that then brings us to my job here today then, I guess, on the History of Everything podcast, explaining how and why we got here. One problem, though, technically, I have already done this. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times over the past year, with 2 videos explaining the Iranian water and energy crisis, and another one explaining the growth and then collapse of the Iranian shadow fleet that kept its economy on life support all of these years. In fact, as I said, it was only about 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point that I did the video on the shadow fleet and showed just how bad the Iranian economy had become. But I do not think that I explained to you just how incredibly dire things are. And so to that end, I will be forced to do some recap and set the stage for you to understand just how inefficient, corrupt, and utterly backwards the Iranian state is, and why the people within it are finally at the point where enough is enough. So, okay, here we go then. Quick history lesson. And yes, this is going to be a speed run. So if you do want a deeper dive, especially into the nitty gritty of like the water crisis issue, the politics issues, the sanctions issues, all the varying different aspects that really complete the story, you do need to go and check out my deeper dives in my other videos. This is the overview that is necessary to understand the protests that are happening now and why the state may just collapse.
But my friends, before we continue with today's story, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Aura. Which is very important, mind you, because I'm sure that for any of you who are watching this right now, any denizens of the internet, you're probably wondering, why the heck is it that I keep on getting flooded with spam calls and emails and things like that? And the answer is because your information is being sold by data brokers out there online. That is why I recommend today's sponsor, Aura, to my friends, followers, and family, because they actually take care of the hard part, automatically removing your info from these sites and keeping it off. Because the thing is, Aura is so much more than just a digital security service. You get alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web, you get real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more, as well as US-based support available around the clock if something goes wrong. If something does go wrong somehow, you have up to $5 million in identity theft protection from Aura. So yeah, you're kind of covered. Seriously, there are so many bad actors out there on the internet, and considering how many people I have had that have made threats against me, my friends, my family, and more because of what it is that I do, I cannot let myself be vulnerable, and honestly, you should not either. Make sure to go to my link down in the description and try Aura for free for 14 days. Go to aura.com/history-of-everything, and just by trying it out, you can see for the first 14 days whether or not your data is out there on the internet. Please be safe, my friends. If there is anything that we have shown, the world is a dangerous and very complex place.
Because, my friends, the collapse of the Iranian economy is not something that is a single event, but it is a prolonged period and process of decay, something that has been marked by several critical turning points. The crisis stems from a combination of crippling international sanctions, catastrophic domestic mismanagement, systemic corruption, and profound structural flaws within the Islamic Republic's theocratic state that really it has no way or incentive to fix in the first place. As most are aware by now, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution would overthrow the monarchist government of the Shah of Persia, establishing a theocratic republic. The new Islamist regime under Ayatollah Khomeini would immediately nationalize vast sectors of the economy, including banks, insurance companies, and major industries. This, combined with the revolutionary chaos, would then lead to a massive flight of capital and brain drain as the most educated and business elite of society would flee the country. Following this, you would have the Iranian hostage crisis, which of course led to the complete severing of ties with the United States, which prior to this had been Iran's largest economic and military partner. Sanctions thus began, cutting Iran off from global financial systems and Western technology, and Iraq under Saddam Hussein would then take advantage of the chaos and weakness of the state to launch his own invasion. Yeah, it wasn't a great start to say the least, and this devastating 8-year war would go and cripple the economy of Iran. It consumed an estimated 25 to 50% of its entire GDP, destroying infrastructure, and caused hundreds of thousands of casualties. It was World War I, but in the 1980s. It was brutal. The regime's policy of war economy would focus all resources on the war effort, and it would lead to severe rationing, hyperinflation, and severe shortages, as well as concentrated practically all wealth and power in the hands of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which ran everything. Like, yeah, I need to be blunt with you here right now. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is possibly the closest thing you would have to a militarized theocratic mega corporation that you might see in some kind of like sci-fi game or novel. I spoke about this before and I use Stellaris as an example. It sounds like a build that you would make in that. It is wild. Anyway, after the war, the economy was in shambles, as you can expect. President Hashemi Rafsanjani would attempt to liberalize and rebuild. And while some free market reforms were introduced, these oftentimes were very half-hearted and undermined by hardliners who would rather keep the power themselves. The state's grip on the economy remained absolute, and instead of an entrepreneurial middle class, this period saw the rise of the bonyads, which are parastatal charitable foundations that were tax-exempt and answered only to the supreme leader, which creates a little bit of a problem. These foundations, built on confiscated assets, would evolve into massive opaque conglomerates that controlled everything from construction and banking to the production of soda and telecommunications. They did all of this. They became hubs of corruption and inefficiency, crowding out any private businesses that wanted to start up and operate with zero accountability whatsoever because, again, they were backed by the state, and from that, the will of God. Well, the will of God as determined by the Ayatollah, but yeah. Which sounds absolutely awful. And yes, it absolutely was. But technically speaking, it was not going to be too big of a problem yet. And the reason I say that is because the thing about petrostates, which is what Iran definitely was and is that for a while at least, they were able to cover up just how bad things were and mollify the population so long as oil prices remained high enough and trade existed. And when that goes away, well, everything goes to crap pretty quick, which is, yeah, that's exactly what happened over the course of the 2000s. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013 was, to put it bluntly, an economic disaster. He implemented disastrous populist policies such as replacing targeted subsidies with direct cash handouts to nearly every citizen, and this was in turn funded by printing money, which led to rampant inflation, oftentimes exceeding 40% annually, and a complete collapse in the value of the rial, which is Iran's currency. His administration also would deny the inflation problem for years, preventing any kind of corrective action because you can't go against the will of God. And by 2012, the rial was in freefall, having lost over half of its value in just a matter of months at that time. Yeah, by the way, that problem never really was going to go away, and somehow, despite all these issues, the state managed to get the funds to start up a nuclear program. Go figure. But still, Iran's pursuit of nuclear capability became the central issue in its international relations, as this led to the first round of UN, EU, and US sanctions that targeted its financial sector in a while, especially its central bank, oil exports, and access to technology. Again, I explained this in more detail in my previous video talking about the Iranian shadow fleet, so go check that out. But fast forward then to 2015, and things do ease up a bit because President Hassan Rouhani was relatively moderate in comparison to his predecessors. Under him, Iran would sign the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or nuclear deal as we know it, with world powers. And in exchange for curbs on its nuclear program, most international sanctions were lifted. So it was then that for about 2 years, Iran's economy would recover. Oil exports would surge back to pre-sanctioned levels, and inflation was brought under control, and GDP would grow significantly. Foreign investment would gradually begin to trickle back in, and this would be great overall for the economy, but the benefits were not evenly distributed, and the underlying structural problems that we spoke about here before, the bonyads, the corruption, the state control, all of that remained untouched, meaning that even if wealth was coming back into the country, it wasn't going to the lower population. The relief was also at the same time then very short-lived. This is because in 2018, US President Donald Trump would unilaterally withdraw the United States from the JCPOA and would reimpose the maximum pressure sanctions of earlier, this time with even greater severity, which helped to push the Iranian economy that was already teetering over the edge into a full-blown collapse. The crashing of oil prices, the shutdown of global trade due to COVID, and all the problems that we already spoke about here with bonyads and more, all of these were also strong contributing factors, and it essentially created what you would call the perfect storm. And yes, I know that I am skipping quite a lot here in terms of the historical context and more, but again, I have explained it before in older videos, so you can go check those out if you want more. Still, this was necessary in order to show you just how it was that we got to the year of 2025 and to the point on December 28th when the rotten core of the Iranian state would finally burst. So yes, okay then. As I make this right now, in early 2026, we can ask ourselves what exactly is going on in Iran to make all of what is going on possible. And the answer is that it is a combination of external geopolitical shifts and the final fatal consequences of decades of internal mismanagement that we showed here. To explain this, first, arguably the single most important factor in 2025 was the successful implementation of new, far more aggressive international sanctions, and enforcement led by the United States and coordinated with European and key Middle Eastern allies. Previous sanctions, while yes, they were technically severe, they did still allow for significant illicit oil exports, primarily to China. In 2025, a multi-pronged strategy would finally choke off this last lifeline, as we had covered before in our previous video. The US began to aggressively impose sanctions on Chinese refineries, shipping companies, financial institutions, all things that were processing Iranian oil. This made the cost of doing business with Iran prohibitively high for most Chinese players. Along with that, the cooperation from Gulf Arab states and the US Navy made monitoring and interdiction of sanctions evading tankers in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz much more effective, dramatically increasing the risk and cost of smuggling, which, again, reduces the amount of money that can actually come into the Iranian state. Lastly, sanctions were expanded to target any remaining financial loopholes. Iran's access to even the most basic international banking channels were severed, compounding severe shortages of essential goods like medicine and specialized food items within the country. To put it bluntly, the oil money was quite simply gone. And with that money being gone, the Iranian currency that remained quickly became worthless. Like I kid you not, even at the time that I'm talking about this, the currency was trading near zero. It's worth so little that when you look at the multi-digit levels of things, like for $1 is equal to whatever certain amount, it will say zero because there are so many zeros in front of the currency in negative manner that it's worth nothing. In the first quarter of 2025, the Iranian rial would lose over 60% of its value against the US dollar on the open market, crashing from around 600,000 rial to the dollar to over 1 million. The government's official exchange rate became a complete fiction, relevant only to the regime's inner circle that could actually benefit from the false rate. This currency collapse would trigger full-blown hyperinflation. While the official inflation rates would hover near 80%, some independent economists have estimated that the real rate of price increases for essential goods, food, fuel, medicine, and more was well over 200% actually. The salaries and savings of the middle and working class were completely wiped out. If you were some kind of basic civic worker or a teacher, something that you received a standard monthly wage from the state, that meant that month to month, you could no longer cover a simple week's worth of basic groceries. Just to give you an idea of how bad this is, Morningstar data shows that the value of the rial was around 42,000 to the dollar back in mid-December. But if you fast forward that to today in mid-January, it is more than 1.1 million rial to the dollar. Even at the time that I'm telling you this, you can probably go onto the internet right now and Google and see what is the value of the rial currently, because it's fluctuating so badly that 1.1 even got to as high as 1.4 million before it recovered slightly, and now it either has gotten worse or better. We don't know. It is just impossible to track, but this was the all-time low that it managed to reach. In terms of purchasing power of goods from outside of the country, money within Iran, or at least the Iranian currency, is suddenly worth nothing. Like you can't use it to do anything. And internally, the picture isn't exactly a whole lot better. And here's what it is that I mean. Iran, over the past several decades, has suffered from persistently high inflation. But in the past 12 months, it has reached near unfathomable levels. It jumped from 31.8% in January of 2025 to 48.6% by October. December's figure has been cited as being above 42% alone, and it's insane. It really is insane. Annual inflation was in excess of 32% for the most recent available year of 2024, as data shows from the World Bank. This places it 9th highest in the world for that year, but again, we're talking about official rates. On the ground for basic foodstuffs and other things, it's even worse, but it's almost impossible to tell with tight restrictions that come from Iran. Just to give you an idea of how difficult things are to do business or any kind of long-term planning within Iran, since the year 2008, it has only seen inflation rates below 25% in 5 out of 16 years. A healthy inflation rate, mind you, is supposed to be around 2%. That's ideal. If it's higher, like 3 or 4%, it's not great, but if your GDP growth also meets that, it's not the worst. In Iran's case, no, its economy is shrinking while it is that its inflation is going out of control. And that constant pressure on rising prices means that citizens' savings and spending power have utterly cratered, which in turn, my friends, means that it creates not just one problem, but rather several, all at the same time. And each one of these problems makes the other problems within the list significantly worse on their own. First among them, the government's inability to pay its bills and import raw materials has caused a domino effect throughout the entirety of the economy and society. As an example of this, state-owned power plants are unable to afford imported parts or fuel, and they began to implement rolling blackouts of up to 16 hours a day in major cities like Tehran, the capital, like literally the capital of the country, where for 2/3 of the day, no one has electricity. This would paralyze industrial production and daily life. And hey, guess what? Factories would then shut down en masse due to said power shortages, as well as the inability to secure imported machinery, spare parts, or raw materials, which in turn would lead to a huge surge in unemployment, which by some estimates was placed at over 25% of the entire country by mid-2025. Wow. Okay, but hey, it's fine, right? It's fine, because as long as the state continues to subsidize the population, as they have for years with oil money, then everything would be fine, right? Oh, wait, no, hold on, yeah. How could I forget? In terms of oil money, there is no money. I've already explained this. The shelves in state-subsidized grocery stores, which once were a pillar of the regime's social contract with its people, have consistently been empty. The black market for everything from baby formula to car tires has exploded, with prices being inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. But Stack, you may wonder, what about basic necessities such as food? Surely at least that was able to be produced, even if fancier imported things could not be obtained. And to that I say, no. And to you who asked the question, it means you clearly have not seen any of my videos that I've done on the Iranian water crisis. Because after 5 years of drought, Iran's farms simply cannot produce enough to feed the country, and the soaring prices of food imports have hit the Iranian people hard. Such high levels of inflation would wipe out the value of people's savings and leave many Iranians struggling to afford even basic food items, and that has made people desperate. Something that you absolutely do not want in an oppressive regime like the Ayatollahs. The economic catastrophe would in turn exacerbate the deep fractures that already existed within the Iranian political system, but had never been able to be acted upon properly before, leading to complete paralysis in any decision-making that could actually do something positive. With the economic pie shrinking to almost nothing, the internal power struggle between the IRGC, the Bonyads, and the traditional clerical establishment would become vicious, with each faction going and blaming the other for the crisis, and would fight to control the dwindling revenue streams from smuggling and other illicit activities as they tried to keep themselves alive. And the people? Well, the average Iranian had dealt with enough for far too long. And now the whole thing was going to come crashing down. So it was then, my friends, that on the 28th of December 2025, groups of shopkeepers and merchants in Tehran and other commercial centers would go on strike by closing their shops. Simultaneously, as this was going down, protest gatherings were being formed around these locations, and images and videos of widespread shop closures would circulate on social media. According to reports, protesters would cite the rising dollar exchange rate and market instability, warning that continued conditions were only going to lead to bankruptcy of many small and medium-sized businesses, which simply could not compete with the large state-backed entities. On this day, the rial would hit its new low, plunging to 1.42 million to the dollar. Essentially, the currency, as I explained earlier, was worthless, and shopkeepers' livelihoods were at stake. Still, despite the protests, there were no reported clashes necessarily with security forces on this day, and things did remain peaceful. That, however, was not going to remain the case. The protests would continue into their second day on the 29th of December and expand across various parts of Tehran, including the Grand Bazaar. Merchants and shopkeepers would close their businesses and gather in the streets to protest, which this time was met with more force, as police would fire tear gas to disperse protesters in the capital. That same day, central bank head Mohammad Reza Farzan would go and resign, and the protests would start to pick up in other cities. In fact, one video would end up going viral of an unidentified protester that sat in the middle of the Jomuri Islami street at Tehran, who refused to move for motorcycle security forces that were trying to get through. But later, he was beaten and forced to leave. The protester became known as Tehran's Tank Man, which is a reference to the Tank Man during the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest massacre. But the massacre in this case was about to start. By this point, everyone had started to realize that something far more serious than simple discontent was at play here. Years of anger was starting to bubble forth. As protests began to include more and more cities on December 30th, as well as several university campuses, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian would go and meet with a group of business leaders to listen to their demands and pledge that his administration would, quote, not spare any effort for solving problems, end quote, with the economy. Things had not quite gotten violent yet, necessarily, but arrests were starting to be made in larger numbers, and the violence was only going to increase. Because by the fourth day, December 31st, that is when things really began to take a turn. On that day, people within the cities of Isfahan, Kermanshah, and Fasa would begin to gather in protests of their own. With in Fasa, people holding a large rally in front of the governor's office, while in Kermanshah, the markets went on complete strike, shutting everything down. As the protests were starting to grow, according to reports, police began to fire live ammunition and tear gas into the protesters, killing multiple people. And the government would in turn order a nationwide total business shutdown in most of the country, due to what they said was cold weather, though most analysts looking at this believe that the real intention was actually to shut down the protests and stop people from gathering. At the same time, the government began to threaten to crack down specifically on protesters as videos began to emerge of merchants, women's rights activists, and students shouting slogans like "Death to the Dictator," referring to Iran's supreme theocratic leader. And so yes, my friends, I know that at the time I'm talking about this, obviously we are skipping quite a lot of detail here because, oh dear God, if I talked about every single little thing, an outburst of violence, we would be here literally all week. But all of that brings us to January 1st, New Year's Day, 2026. It was not going to get any better for the Iranian government. I say that because on January 1st, the protest's first fatalities were officially reported, with authorities saying that at least 7 people had been killed. The most intense violence would appear to have been in Azna, which is a city in Iran's Loristan province, where videos were posted online that purported to show objects in the street ablaze and gunfire echoing in the background as people were shouting, "Shameless, shameless." The semi-official Fars news agency would report that 3 people had been killed. Other protesters were reportedly killed in Bakhtiari and Isfahan provinces, while a 21-year-old volunteer in the paramilitary Revolutionary Guard Basij force was killed in Loristan. Things at this point were escalating. And it's at this point that the US President Donald Trump would get himself involved in the matter by opening his mouth, as he is prone to doing. On January 2nd, Trump would go and write on his Truth Social platform that if Iran, quote, violently kills peaceful protesters, the United States will come to their rescue, end quote. The warning, only months after American forces had bombed Iranian nuclear sites, includes the assertion, without elaboration, that, quote, we are locked and loaded and ready to go, end quote. Yeah, considering how the very next day, on January 3rd, is when the US would launch its military operation that successfully kidnapped the president of Venezuela without a single fatality on their part. If you consider that, the words start to carry a lot more weight. Protests, in the meantime, would go and expand to reach more than 100 different locations in 22 of Iran's 31 provinces, according to the US-based human rights activist news agency. Things were only growing, and it's at this point that the Iranian state was done with any half measures or simple platitudes. No, it was going to pull out the playbook for what had worked time and time again in the past, as we have covered here before: brute and overwhelming force. On January 3rd, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei would say, quote, rioters must be put in their place, end quote. This was effectively a green light for security forces to begin more aggressively putting down the demonstrations. Despite this, protests would continue to expand to more than 170 different locations in 25 provinces, with at least 15 people getting killed and hundreds being arrested. In Shiraz, videos would show that police were assaulting and beating a man on the ground. When protesters threw projectiles at the police, officers moved towards them on motorcycles. After this happened, moments later, a protester would end up pouring gasoline on one of the officers and setting him on fire. As you could probably expect from this, there was no turning back. And over the course of the next several days, the violence was only going to escalate. And my friends, when I'm talking about all this, I don't want to necessarily take away from the story or my presentation or anything like that, but the next major development to take place is one that genuinely makes me pause and ask myself, what kind of timeline are we living in? Because as all of this is going down, as the violence is escalating, the exiled crown prince of the old Pahlavi dynasty that was overthrown back in the 1979 revolution would take center stage, calling for the fall of the government and encouraging people to go out into the streets to protest. Yeah, that happened. Pahlavi would express his support for the protesters and called on all Iranians, including security and law enforcement forces, to join the protests. And at least some of the protesters actually heeded his call, as the Associated Press would note that, quote, Pahlavi had called for demonstrations at 8 p.m. local time on Thursday, January 8th. When the clock struck, neighborhoods across Tehran would erupt in chanting, witnesses would say, and these chants included death to the dictator and death to the Islamic Republic. Others would praise the Shah, shouting, this is the last battle, Pahlavi will return. Thousands could be seen on the streets before all communication to Iran was cut out, as the theocracy would shut down all internet access, plunging people into complete silence. No one could get any information in or out. Well, I say silence. The people were still very much angry and out in the streets yelling, but now they couldn't tweet about it. And this, my friends, is something that I really do have to address because it brings up the question that many probably have about whether Iran will return to being a monarchy again, which sounds absolutely wild to say if the government truly does collapse. The short answer is that we really don't know, as it's difficult to gauge just how much support Reza Pahlavi actually has. See, to explain this here, because I've talked about the Iranian Revolution a couple of times, but I haven't really mentioned him specifically. You see, Pahlavi was born in Tehran on October 31st, 1960, and officially he was named Crown Prince at the age of 7. His path from there seemed pretty much straightforward. He was destined for the throne until the 1979 revolution began to upend the entire region. Prior to that, at the age of 17, he had left Iran actually for fighter pilot training in the US at Reese Air Force Base in Texas. And while he was away, the monarchy collapsed and the current political system was established, which didn't exactly want him to return, so they barred him. In exile, Pahlavi would complete his training, and later he would actually get a degree in political science from the University of Southern California, but the focus of his and other exiled Iranians was always back home. In fact, fun detail here, but during the Iran-Iraq War back in the 1980s, he even famously volunteered to go back and serve as a fighter pilot for his country under the Islamic Republic, but that was rejected by the authorities in Tehran, who did not want him back to risk anything. From that point, he has lived in exile ever since, residing in the US with his wife, Yasmin Pahlavi, and their 3 daughters. For more than 40 years, he has advocated for a referendum and nonviolent change to bring back the monarchy, but obviously nothing has happened. It's at this point then that his rhetoric has sharply changed in recent days. On Saturday, January 10th, he would urge workers in key sectors, transport, oil, and gas, to launch nationwide strikes to cut off the financial lifelines of the state. He specifically called upon the youth of the Immortal Guard, the old imperial forces that, his family had, and security forces to defect, saying, I too am preparing to return to the homeland so that at the end of our national revolution's victory, I can be beside you. Which, oh dear God, if that happens, yeah, that would be insane. But as you can probably expect, the response from the theocratic Iranian state was less than welcoming, as we should say. In fact, furious would be far more accurate. On Sunday, January 11th, state-affiliated media outlets would label the protests as a new phase of insecurity and an internal armed war, with a report by the conservative Vatan-e-Imrouz newspaper, cited by the Tasnim news agency, describing Pahlavi's call as a cover for a terrorist nuclei to attack police and government forces where dozens had already been killed, saying, and I quote, "Do not be mistaken. This is not merely a riot. These were armed terrorist attacks," end quote. Officials in the Islamic Republic have linked Pahlavi's escalation to foreign interference, specifically accusing the United States and Israel of this, as they claim the unrest is a Plan B by US President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, following the conclusion of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran in May of this past year, where, Iran was absolutely humiliated in that, and that is arguably one of the things that has weakened its position to allow all this to happen. Still, despite this support, it is again difficult to say just how strong of support Pahlavi actually has, as for decades, opposition within Iran has been extremely divided and weak. People are yelling Pahlavi in the streets of Iran, not because they actually want him per se, but because really there's no other name to actually yell. Nearly 50 years of theocratic rule has left very little opportunity for any major oppositions to gather together in any kind of a real strength, which has left Pahlavi as one of the only faces that can actually be recognized. Even Trump, despite his support, would also express reservations about Pahlavi, frequently calling him a nice guy in interviews, but then also at the same time raising doubts about whether or not Iran would even accept his leadership. The people, not just the state, but the people accept his leadership, saying, and I quote, "He seems very nice, but I don't know how he'd play within his own country. We really aren't up to that point yet. I don't know whether or not his country would accept his leadership, and certainly if they would, that would be fine with me." End quote. So yeah, when these words come from Trump, who is usually significantly more boisterous, that level of reservation is definitely worrying. But as it is, though, we don't really know what is in store, except that things are more than likely going to get significantly worse. And what I mean by that is that if we just go back ever so slightly, on January 9th, Iran had signaled that a crackdown was coming, but protesters were still continuing to demonstrate. The very next day, Iran's Attorney General, Mohammad Movedi Azad, would even warn that anyone taking part in protests would be considered, and I quote, an enemy of God. Yeah, that is a death penalty charge in the theocratic state. So yeah, that's not a de-escalation, to say the least. Public forced confessions of protesters being detained by the military were becoming common, and public executions were being announced to take place. By January 13th, the death toll of the protests had surpassed 2,500 people, according to reports on the ground. Though, of course, an accurate exact number is really impossible to obtain at this point. Trump would say that he had called off any meetings with the Iranians and promised that the unspecified help is on the way. Now, I know that sounds vague, so allow me to say verbatim what he said on Truth Social. And I quote, Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take over your institutions. Save the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. MIGA, so like make Iran great again. President Donald J. Trump. Which, okay. Yeah, wow. Something is probably going to happen. In response to that, on January 14th, Iran would promise retaliation if the United States or Israel would intervene in the domestic unrest, and Iranian officials would signal that fast trials and executions lay ahead for suspects that were detained in the nationwide protests. In fact, Iranian state television would even go and broadcast footage of Donald Trump's attempted assassination in the 2024 Butler, Pennsylvania rally, which was accompanied by a message saying, and I quote, "This time the bullet won't miss," end quote. Yeah, you heard me right. They just threatened to assassinate the president of the United States, who is internationally famous for having a big mouth, being a hothead, and literally kidnapping the dictator of Venezuela. I, for one, cannot wait to see how it is that this plays out. But yeah, my friends, that brings us to January 15th and 16th, the final days when I can inform you on what has actually been happening, as that is when I am writing and filming this video itself. Lord knows with how fast things are moving that things could very easily be different by the time this video comes out, but the situation is not a great one. As tensions between the United States and Iran continue to escalate, multiple sources have reported that the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is redeploying from the South China Sea to the Middle East. U.S. Ambassador to the United States, Mike Waltz, would tell the UN Security Council on Thursday, January 15th, that, quote, "The United States stands by the brave people of Iran, and President Donald Trump has made it clear all options are on the table to stop the slaughter," end quote. This naturally is going to make people question what exactly is going to go down, and Arab Gulf nations in the area have been watching very nervously as they see any military action that could take place as a move that would plunge the region into chaos and likely affect them. In fact, behind the scenes, Saudi Arabia has reportedly been lobbying the US administration to refrain from striking Iran, while Qatar and Oman have focused all diplomatic outreach efforts between Iranian and American officials to try and keep things from popping off. The three countries would shift into high gear diplomacy to de escalate tensions after reports would emerge on Wednesday that suggested that contact between Washington and Tehran had all broken down, which in turn raised fears that an attack was imminent. Now, whether or not it is, who knows? The killings on the streets of Iran are continuing. The state appears to be crumbling, and even now, if at this exact moment everything were to stop and go back to the way it was prior to December 28th, nothing is actually going to get better. As we talked about here multiple times, Iran is a state that is utterly broken, backwards, and incredibly corrupt. It has managed to survive decades longer than anyone possibly could have predicted that it would, but its current form is practically on life support. Again, if you saw my previous video on the Iranian shadow fleet, you would understand that it is basically the physical manifestation of said life support, and now that is being cracked down upon more effectively than ever. With oil money gone, the state of Iran appears to be unironically using its own people's bodies to make up the difference. Multiple reports have now come out of families of dead protesters being forced to fork out large sums of money in return for the bodies of their loved ones that were killed by the state. One person would say that security forces demanded 700 million tomans, or $5,000, to release the body of their loved one, who was being held at Porcina Hospital. Another family in Tehran would say that they were asked to pay 1 billion tomans, or $7,000, for their loved one. This being a Kurdish seasonal construction worker who only was earning about $100 a month, meaning the family had literally no way to possibly ever pay for that. But the state needs the money, I guess. So even now, as I'm talking about that, as it is, the Pentagon is preparing to deploy additional US troops and military equipment to the Middle East, as tensions in the region remain elevated. These are set to arrive over the next coming days and weeks, which means that if anything should happen, it is likely going to be soon. But as it is, that is really all that I can say right now, my friends. I would like to thank all of you for watching, and should anything happen, you can bet that we're going to be making another video, my fourth one within a year, talking about Iran. So that would be a lot of fun to do. Yeah. And also at the end here, and I'm going to put something here at the beginning. If anyone who's wondering like how it is that I sound the way that I do, or why this may be a little blurry or off, I am in Thailand right now, and I am holding my microphone. So when I get these comments that complain about audio quality, note that if I look kind of weird or I sound kind of weird at any point, it means that I'm traveling, which also means that the video is probably going to be insane because it's going to be talking about somewhere in the world that is destroying itself because it decided to do that the moment that I traveled. If you have any suggestions on what I should do for like lab mics or other kinds of things that could make that better, let me know in the comments. Like genuinely, I do look at them. I do read them. So yeah, that would be helpful. Anyway, my friends, thank you all very much for watching. I will see you all here next time, and goodbye. Best of luck.